How did we get here? Where the rights of marginalized communities are on a mid-20th century backslide? Where people of color are kept from voting? Where free speech extends to a swastika, but not an anti-fascist protest? Where members of the LGBTQ community are forced into hiding again, not back into the closet, but literal hiding from persecution, prosecution, or worse. Where we're more scared of what cops might or might not do than what might happen if we didn't have them at all. Where we can't afford to live comfortably, much less save to survive later in life, but multi-billionaires exist while legions of the poor defend hoarding wealth while having zero chance of ever even seeing a six-figure salary, much less $1 million. How do so many Americans care more about wealthy elites that they'll never meet or be than they do about the person suffering, sitting right next to them? Why do we surrender our compassion and empathy as easy as we do our rights, liberties, and freedoms? Of course, ignoring the former will snap to defend the latter, hyperbolically and hypocritically. How did America go from proud patriotism to white supremacist evangelical nationalist cult domestic terrorist organizations bullying our local communities and infiltrating our city, county, state, and federal governments? Hell, your HOAs. The rise of radical evangelical extremism isn't the answer. It's part of it, and I'll cover it in a future series. It's certainly the Mentos down the 2-liter of diet soda, but the issue really involves some key tech and legislative developments, key figures that moved all of this into place, which I covered in part 1. Then the man who would shift his own ideology and the nation's in the process, which I covered in part 2. Despite the catchy title, I'm not really into conspiracy theories, but this one's just too delicious not to indulge. Mostly because if this wasn't orchestrated, then it's a brilliant study in collective hive mind brain science, personality development, mental health, social evolution, or devolution, as it were. If it was deliberate, then this is the single greatest atrocity of dictating the human path since, the First Council at Nicaea. So if you want to suggest that there was some big conspiracy of organized collusion here, that's on you. If you're the kind of person that Googles Bilderberg and enjoys rabbit holes, then maybe you might draw your own conclusions. I'm simply laying out the socio-cultural facts of the mid to late 20th century to now, as they appear on a timeline, and the implications of those facts on society today. Pragmatically, with selective snark and commentary, but still. In this episode, I'm continuing the tale of Buckaroo Bonzo, Ronald Reagan, and how his rise to power initially conflicted with Richard Nixon's, but the two eventually coiled together like the sneaky snakes they were. How the issues of labor power, workers' rights, unions, and civil rights drove a wedge between Americans and turned us into a true two-party system of ideologies, dictating our ideologies. Pick a pen, either or, bye-bye, black sheep, or white sheep, as it were. How paranoias of socialism and communism, without even knowing what those things are, and the erosion of America's ethical integrity brought many Americans into the cults of Nixon, Reagan, and MAGA. And the most dangerous cult of all, Dunning-Kruger. And welcome to the podcast. In discussing the era of America's ethical erosion, I brought up the Attitude Era of the 90s as an example of when it all went horribly wrong for us. However, the 1950s and the 1970s can't be ignored either. Two central figures of politics would transform the nation. They weren't friends at first. Then they were rivals, enemies almost. But they found a common ground that aligned them in a quest for unified, centralized power in Washington, while publicly fighting against a powerful centralized government. History is written by the victors, and those victors have sought to minimize the connection between Richard Milhous Nixon and Ronald Reagan. But their destinies were woven together early on. As early as the late 1940s, during the liberal Democrat Reagan's initial run as president of Hollywood's Screen Actors Guild, conservative Republican Nixon was serving as a California representative on the House Labor Committee. The Union was embroiled in labor disputes and negotiations as Reagan took over the position from Elizabeth Montgomery's father, from Bewitched. As I mentioned in the last episode, Reagan was a pro-labor Democrat until, officially the mid-60s. The early 50s is important because while Nixon never wavered from his anti-labor sentiments, Reagan's views on the working Joe during this period certainly veered from his father's pro-labor views as Ron's ambitions grew. While Ron and Dick might have come to see things similarly down the road, during the 50s, at very least, ideological opposition and friction may have been present. Just from the politics, the heat of labor disputes. Whatever experience the two had together, Reagan had chosen to support Nixon's political rival in the 1950 California midterm, where Nixon was attempting to rise in status and power from the House to the Senate. Helen Gahagan Douglas, an actor who inspired Disney's Evil Queen in Snow White, had joined the Democrats under FDR with Eleanor Roosevelt mentoring. Douglas joined the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League in 1939 and publicly boycotted and called for America to boycott products made by Nazis and in Nazi Germany. The Hollywood Anti-Nazi League was popular, as one could imagine. Who doesn't oppose a Nazi, right? It attracted many people from different ideologies. After all, who doesn't oppose a Nazi, right? Including, among many others, the Communist Party USA. What's that? That's America's Communist Party. But no, it wasn't. It is. It was since 1919 and has been ever since. We also had an American Socialist Party back then. We had lots of parties fighting for a lot of things, but the Communist Party USA wasn't Russian communists. Well, I can't say none. I've not seen a roster. American communism wasn't and isn't advocating for any kind of communism anywhere else any more than America's capitalism advocates for anyone else's capitalism. Some people do things a little differently, especially when it comes to the rights of the working class. Communism, like socialism, on paper, has principles in place that speaks power to the people in their systems, more than power to the powerful. In fact, of the three on topic here, communism, capitalism, and socialism, one of these things is not like the other. Two advocate power to the people, one places a price tag on everything, especially people. It's a lot more complicated, but that's a great place to start if you're creating your own conspiracy. We'll come back to Nixon, Reagan, and even Douglas, but let's overthink for a moment some of what I discussed in Labor Pains. The American working class has been under attack in America for most of the 20th century. Why? Because as America experimented with its brand of capitalism, it failed over and over. It turned out capitalism in America didn't work without slavery. It was that low overhead that kept us going. Again, simplified, but one day America's workforce in the southern agricultural areas had to not only be liberated, but paid if you wanted them to work. Well, that throws a wrench into our profit margins now, don't it, y'all? I've also talked about how many abolitionists back then wanted the slaves freed out of humanity concerns, but also wanted those freed slaves sent anywhere else but here. Why? Lots of reasons. If you have a choice of working outside in a field or inside in a factory, which would you choose? If you had a choice of working where you were once beaten and used as livestock, maybe you'd go somewhere you felt safer. So now that the slaves were freed, they could get any job they could get hired for, even yours. And many other racist concerns, of course. Needless to say, wage stagnation, child labor, the exploitation of almost every immigrant group, consensual or non, is how America's economy did, has, and still flourishes today. In fact, I might argue that America cannot exist even in a capitalism with a conscience economy. Many over the course of history agreed, and that's why in the early 20th century, a lot of pro-labor parties popped up. Many candidates from many parties would run in what we now know that's devolved into a two-party primary where the most connected and compromisable of one party's elite goes against the most corrupt and inexplicably flawed of the other party's elite. Flip a coin on which is which year. What happened was both parties essentially turned on the working class and turned their attention to other matters, making America about bottom-line profits and leaving civil rights on the chopping block again, time and time and time again. This is what's really hard for many of us to understand, is that in context and perspective, this Red Scare, or what I've referred to as Reagan's mental illness of irrational and delusional fear of communism, was nothing more than succumbing to greed. It was a union-busting tactic and a means of gaslighting America against higher education. Communism and socialism, and the parties of those two ideologies in America in the early 20th century were anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, anti-corruption, anti-big business. They were pro-labor, pro-working class, pro-average Joe American. And they gave two shits about the rich guy, because these ideologies recognized through centuries of fine-tuning that power and wealth corrupts, and that wealth is greed, and greed is hoarding, and hoarding from whom? We the people, the ones who work for a living, the ones who are convinced we deserve to be broke because we just didn't try hard enough. As I've referenced in previous episodes, the unifying tenet of all major spiritualities, the sin we commit not only affects the victim, but we, as the sinner, are the victim too. We harm ourselves with our greed and our loyalty to greed-based ideals. Many can't think beyond, well, that CEO ran the company that made the thing everybody wants, so he earned that money. But those are values on things capitalism places, not individuals. Those are contract negotiations that have no representation for the working class in that boardroom. In fact, no one's in the room saying, hey, your workers haven't gotten a raise in 12 years, but this dude's getting a $124 million bonus? As people, our values aren't in dollars and cents, except they've come to be, thanks to Ronald Reagan. The union busting of the mid-20th century was covered a little bit in Labor Pains. I'm coming back around to it in a future episode. Ronald Reagan's transition from anti-racist, pro-labor Democrat to hardline white nationalist Republican is centered around his ambitions and his fears of communism, a delusional paranoia he shared with Nixon, like white supremacy. That paranoia would be one of the key swing factors for Reagan's transformation, paired with an unquenchable thirst for power and the spotlight to which he always felt entitled. Reagan wasn't alone in those fears of communism later in life. In that 1950 campaign against Helen Gallatin Douglas, Nixon rode that blackballing, slanderous train like many did in Washington, so much so that while Reagan wouldn't support the man he described as less than honest and highly undeserving of the high honor paid him, then Representative John F. Kennedy had no problem donating to Nixon's campaign against Helen Gallatin Douglas. Then Democrat Ronald Reagan supported a woman, a progressive, an anti-fascist in 1950 against the Republican Richard Nixon. But the Democrat Catholic Kennedy, who wouldn't walk a black child into a desegregated school later as president, donated to Nixon's Senate campaign to beat the progressive, anti-fascist, anti-Nazi woman. This isn't to say that the fears of infiltration in our government from our enemies wasn't a true and valid concern. This is to say that we were sold a goat and told it was a Camaro. Was the Red Scare real? Sure, in a sense. But it was exploited by those in power to whip up a nationalism through a fear of the unknown. If Americans were educated and knew what communism actually was, they might stop and think, wait, why do we do it this way then? Remember last episode when I said I didn't think Reagan understood communism? I stand by that, academically, intellectually. I'm just not convinced the man had the mental acuity, discipline, or training to truly understand the complexities of the subject. In fact, I'd argue for his stance against it and the power that he had. I'd hope he held a doctorate in government studies and political science. Wouldn't you? Instead, Ronald Reagan, the C student, small-town sportscaster, B-list actor at best, and total sellout as a union boss, had an irrational and delusional fear of communism behind his entire rise to power. Were they really all that irrational? Delusional? Where there's smoke, there's fire, they say, right? I mean, Reagan's bachelor's degree was in economics, right? Many of those fears were sparked by protests around the country during the mid-20th century, key assassinations, boilings over, if you will, and other events that shifted the social temperature. Many of those protests centered around college campuses and college students. Put a pin on that when we get to Reagan's governorship next episode. In fact, protests about a lot of things were on the radar in the mid-20th century. As I spoke about with going off to college and experiencing new things, seeing things from a different perspective than your hometown perspective, many in America began to see the injustices and wrongdoings by America. But Ronald Reagan, who had participated in a student-led walkout protest that cost the head of his college his job, then turned around and squashed not just student protests. He squashed pretty much any protests while he was governor of California. Nixon obviously beat the anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, pro-labor, humanist, and rights advocate, the woman Helen Gagan Douglas. He did so by branding her a communist. Ronald Reagan wouldn't be associated with that. Reagan didn't find the A-list celebrity status he felt entitled to for being handsome with mid-range talent. Reagan resented Hollywood for his respectable but not stellar success. One key element of narcissistic behavior is not taking personal responsibility for things that happen to you, or at least assessing for any possible personal responsibility. In this case, if Reagan didn't get a role or the studio didn't roll out the red carpet for him, they must be communists. He's anti-communist, and if they are too, then why aren't they supporting him? So these people who are against me must be communists. See? I'm not getting the roles I want. My mom and dad were full of shit. These communists are unfair and evil. Laugh it off, but that was the beginning. Douglas may have been a breaking point for Reagan. Her being branded a communist by a man he deemed intolerable? Well, with narcissists, they don't like losing or being on the losing side, much less to men they despise. A narcissist will change personalities just to keep on the winning side, just to keep from losing, just to keep from being wrong, just to keep from admitting they were wrong. With Douglas, Reagan was right, maybe for the last time in his life. In fairness, Reagan probably fell for some of that Red Scare propaganda and didn't like what the Democratic Party was doing or saying to deal with it, or not doing. By the 1952 presidential election, Reagan was urging Eisenhower left, telling the man who actually was a war hero that he should run as a Democrat. Ike didn't listen, but Reagan voiced support for him regardless as a Democrat for Ike. During this 8 years of the Eisenhower presidency, is where Reagan's transformation truly starts to unfold. As I mentioned last episode, under the grooming and mentoring of Lemuel Boulware and others, while under contract for General Electric doing TV shows, Reagan was brought in to speak to GE employees about things pro-corporate, anti-union, even delving into political propaganda speeches as time went on. Lemuel Boulware was an anti-labor working-class oppressor whose ideas delve into a dehumanizing approach to employees regarding workers' rights. Boulwareism. By the 1960 election, even though Kennedy had previously donated to Nixon against Helen Gagan Douglas over Douglas's anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, pro-labor stance that they labeled communism, Jack and Dick stood opposite one another on the debate podium. Reagan stood with Nixon then, sweaty upper lip and all, against John F. Kennedy. Civil rights was coming to a head. It was a hot-button topic in those years, and it was believed that the existing Civil Rights Acts of 1957 that had just been amended the summer of the 1960 election would be evolving and further expanded if Democrats won. Many white supremacists were scared of that, and by 1960, Reagan had all but forgotten his parents. His father, dead for nearly 2 decades, and his mother, who by that point was in the full throes of what's believed to be now as Alzheimer's. She would die within 2 years. Reagan's parents' progressivism was barely a memory by the time Lemuel Boulware sunk his fangs into Bonzo, then sworn over to that same cult that hoisted Dirty Dick as their leader. Nixon was as dirty as politics gets. The man had no couth, no ethics, no integrity, and he won. No one held him accountable until it was too late. And even then, he got away with it and all but retired in Argentina. Nixon labeled Douglas as the pink lady and even said her underwear was pink. Pink, like the feminine shade of red. In those times, red for communism. Of course, the underwear, a sexist dog whistle to belittle her and reduce her to a sex object exposed in everyone's imagination, not to be taken seriously. Nixon, as a man in 1950, was more mass appealing as a candidate, it seemed. He won with nearly 60% of the vote. Besides being tagged a communist, there were criticisms that saw her as a holdover of the Roosevelt New Deal era, which was fine to save America from itself back then, but we needed something else right now. Right? Oh, and of course, big oil. That was my head. This was the time of the big oil booms. Lots of money influence, and all that corruption was flowing into the states like California and Texas, all over, influencing anti-environmental legislation, pro-fossil fuel legislation for years to come. Reagan was watching every move Nixon made. Nixon beat a woman who likely reminded Ron of his mother, albeit probably not as religious. But Helen Gagan Douglas was very much in line with Ron's parents and the way that he was raised. Seeing her fail and get humiliated by Nixon publicly, it must have been difficult for a proud man like Reagan. It might have brought him to see his own mother differently. Weaker. Nixon was from Ron's home state, California. I know he was from Illinois, but why would Ron want to be from there when he could be from Hollywood, right? Nixonian politics was a cancer in every form. The toxicity and sexism, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, and general dislike for the American people accompanied Richard Nixon like a Pepe Le Pew stank trail. Reagan may not have liked the man at first. He may have opposed the man. But Nixon, like Boulware, would be a valuable component to building Reagan into the man who sold the world. Reagan's fall from anti-fascist, pro-labor, anti-nuke progressivism into anti-labor nationalism was evident by the mid-1960s. For a man who was then a decade and a half removed from the most powerful position in the world, the decade prior was a period where Reagan's values changed significantly from those of his parents. During this time, thanks to a hefty contract from General Electric, Ron came under the influence, directly or indirectly, of Lemuel Boulware, a hard-driving, anti-union, anti-communist who oversaw labor relations at GE. One might think Ron sold out his values for this paycheck. Money corrupts, and who among us hasn't seen someone get a little money and lose their ever-loving minds, right? But that doesn't really hold, since Ronald Reagan was a movie star. Surely this contract wouldn't make or break the man. Still, $125,000 a year was nothing to turn your nose at back then. It's approximately $1.4 million by today's standards, which, of course, are incomparable to 80 years ago. Plus, GE basically made his and Nancy's Hollywood Hills home a home of the future, decked out with all the latest innovations, save a robot maid named Rosie. For that, Ron hosted a TV show and was the public face of General Electric Theater, but privately, He was a propagandist stump speaker sent out to brainwash, gaslight, groom, and indoctrinate over 250,000 GE union workers and convert them to conservatives. Boulware's sole purpose of crafting this position for Ronald Reagan was to circumvent union leadership, speaking directly to the workers, which wasn't allowed for obvious reasons. Through this tactic, Boulware could weaken the union members, break them, bend them to his way of thinking so that the workers would turn on the union leaders and side with the corporations. And he used Ronald Reagan to do it. This may seem strange at first, since Reagan at that time was a Democrat. But this period, 1952 to 1964, brought Reagan into contact with many of Boulware's like-minded ilk. For Reagan, these speeches were a chance for him to become more comfortable with an audience rather than cameras, to appear more of a people person than a stiff cardboard cutout Hollywood had trouble casting. Reagan's film career was a disappointment to him in many ways. He was successful, but never the level to which he felt entitled. It's safe to say Ron would come to blame at least part of that on the federal government. After all, World War II is really what derailed the momentum he would never recapture. Hollywood changed after World War II, and Ron realized that he could succeed in Hollywood, but through politics, and then he could show those who doubted him what he was capable of. As an actor, he was forgettable. As the head of SAG, he would wield great influence. Influence to accuse his rivals as potential communists. But imagine if he was more. Lemuel Boulware's influence at GE was significant, and his impact on Reagan was detrimental. There's no evidence that Boulware and Reagan ever actually met. But with Reagan involved with GE's top brass in meetings, conference calls, at their beck and call, it's safe to assume their paths crossed. At the very least, the Boulware impact on Reagan was great. When you're in power, you tend to avoid hiring people who don't agree with you. You hire people who can work as a team. Your team. So what kind of people do you think Boulware and GE employed during Boulware's run? Likely a lot of people who thought like Boulware. Boulware wanted the union gone. He wasn't hiring pro-labor employees to manage his people. Reagan was directly groomed by another man who shared possibly even more extremist views than Boulware. It was the close relationship with a man named Earl Dunkel, a PR guy for GE, that would change forever the man raised by progressive anti-fascist parents. Ron and Dunkel would spend nearly 2 years together in close company. Earl Dunkel was in charge of these speeches Ron gave to GE. He crafted them, with Boulware's blessing and influence, no doubt. Reagan and Dunkel crisscrossed the country together. By train, since it's been said Reagan was scared of flying. Dunkel was a self-proclaimed arch-conservative, as in far-right, alt-right. Reagan then was a New Deal Democrat who had previously hailed FDR as a hero. He supported Truman and begged Eisenhower to run as a Democrat, but still supported him when Ike ran Republican. He opposed Nixon until he didn't, but in the years of 1955 and 56, when Reagan and Dunkel were buddy-buddy, Reagan's weak intellect and limited education were his Achilles heel. The charming talking head schmoozer, Reagan's limited critical thinking was no match for a man of Dunkel's opinionated and bullish nature. I won't say a great deal is known about Earl B. Dunkel in relation to many other key figures of the 20th century. Create your own conspiracy on that one. Dunkel did talk about his time with Reagan quite a bit later in life, where he admitted debating with Ron about politics, specifically Democratic politics. Through this influence, Reagan began reading books, something he wasn't known to do much of while in school. Books on economics, politics, and the theories he barely learned in a structured, disciplined academic setting under the tutelage of learned, experienced experts. He wasn't interested in paying that close of attention into his studies in school. Ron's aspirations were outside of academia. He obtained a degree in economics, but that degree was from a small religious institution, hardly the hub of higher academic credentials. His pursuit was performance. His focus was on being a star, not in learning how to run a business. Let me pause for a moment and say this. It's difficult for me, someone who promotes higher education, to then criticize someone who got a degree and even got a degree in an area related to my chief criticisms of him, economics. It's the lifelong dedication to a subject and seeking an understanding that I don't see in Reagan's story, more than that base level knowledge and radical theory out of context and out of an academic setting. This is Dunning-Kruger at its finest. While I admire and respect anyone who pursues knowledge, it's the self-awareness and humility of understanding what we don't understand that distinguishes confidence from ego. Reagan, who barely scraped by in an academic setting, then, under the brainwashing of an alt-right extremist, began reading what amounts to propaganda out of context. In fact, much of what Reagan consumed media-wise was said to lean pretty far right during these times, without anything from the other perspective to balance his ideals. His progressive, pro-labor parents by this time were no longer an influence. Even if the memory remained, Ron's success dwarfed anything they did. And that likely led his ego to completely dismiss their beliefs altogether and to believe that he had found a better way. While Reagan's speeches for GE were carefully crafted to dissuade the working class from trusting unions or the federal government, Ron's speeches, not just to GE, were growing more and more anti-union, anti-labor, anti-people, and anti-government. Anti-American government. Reagan had supported Nixon's anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, pro-labor opponent in the 1950 Senate race in California. Nixon branded her a communist for being against fascism, Nazis, and fighting for the workers' rights. Reagan, who didn't know no better, swallowed that propaganda whole, feeling that sting, and within a few years he's exposed to Boulware's ideologies, flushed with money, influence, and a fancy new home with all the latest appliances thanks to General Electric. Ron began to see things differently. In 1952, Ron spoke to Fulton College, a religious school in California, for a graduation ceremony. In 1957, he would speak to his alma mater, Eureka College in Illinois. Both speeches were similar, yet the tone was starkly different in just 5 years. At play here are economics and the role government plays in business and the daily lives of the individual. In fact, for many capitalists, you and I alike living under this system, these are our foundational values when discussing politics. Whatever you're discussing, money and how the government factors into decision-making are all at the core. For Reagan, this was certainly true. Yes, personally, I believe wholeheartedly that Ronald Reagan wasn't the least bit intellectually or academically smart enough to understand most of what he was trying to sell to his audiences. I also believe that Ronald Reagan's narcissism, ego, bias, and ambition corrupted any learning the man tried to achieve. Being progressive is easy. It's mostly just compassion for others and seeking a just society in all respects and, well, always learning. Conservatism is greed, fear, and at the core, white supremacy. Perspective is what's important here. These two speeches highlight the evolution of Ronald Reagan from the protege of progressive parents to the flunky for fascist, for-profit, far-right extremists. It isn't a stretch, considering Reagan sold out his colleagues to the feds as a McCarthy blacklister in Hollywood. The red flags of his character were evident all along, if anyone cared to see beyond the cardboard smile. In 1952, Reagan's message to Fulton was that the American people were on a mission from God. Scary enough from a nationalist standpoint. It was centered around a very Joel Osteen-style message of an anointed and consecrated prosperity through patriotism. It was mid-50s post-World War II shtick, pandering to the lowest intellectual common denominator who actually believe the creator of everything favors them above all else. Problematic, but nothing compared to where he'd be 5 years later at Eureka College. That same speech held to the sentiments from the earlier commencement. But this time, Reagan, brainwashed by his time at GE under Boulware and Dunkel among others, spoke more about the advancement of technology and consumerism, still wrapped up with God's promise, which would be a cornerstone of Reagan's America moving forward. Reagan's previous admiration of Roosevelt and his New Deal faded as Dunkel's cancerous influence ate away at Reagan's brain. Reagan had become anti-government, anti-American government. Isn't it weird how so many patriots hate the American government? Some of this is Dunkel and the Boulware effect. Some can probably be blamed on some of the books Reagan read, films he watched, speeches he saw and was told to give, in context or without. Maybe Reagan wasn't a bad actor. Maybe he just read the script so much he went method. Maybe I need to overthink Stanislavski next. Let me frame this in a way that might make some more sense. I could reinvent the wheel here, but Jacob Weisberg wrote an article for Slate in 2016 that encapsulates this perfectly, in a way that if I tried, I'd still just be paraphrasing his writing. Reagan went from seeing the New Deal as having saved America and Roosevelt as the man daring enough to make that happen, to seeing FDR as a socialist bully who forced his ideas on the American people at a time when they were most vulnerable in order to grow the federal government to lord over the people's will rather than facilitate the people's prosperity. In fact, while FDR saw corporate power as the greatest threat to the American people, with government regulation being the salvation, Reagan would come to see that corporations were the true saviors of America, and the products they sold were the currency that would drive our economy. Roosevelt was upper class, affluent. He came from money. Franklin was a cousin of Teddy, the founder of the Progressive Party and American hero. Roosevelt was privilege in America. Roosevelt also was governor of one of the largest states in the country, who later served as president, a playbook Reagan would use. Reagan came from lower middle class America, well, poor at times. While Reagan didn't work a day in his life for anything he achieved, Reagan's journey was from people who did work hard. Now, you give us a guy with good looks, mid-range talent, limited intellect, questionable work ethic, and everybody opening doors for him because he's dashing, charming, and one hell of a schmoozer. Here's the rub. Reagan came from lower middle class, but Reagan wasn't lower middle class. He never considered himself that. He always considered himself better than that, more than that. And this is my conjecture based on my armchair psychological profile of a man long dead whom I never met. Still, it's hard to argue that wasn't in his mind. After all, he completely abandoned everything about the lower middle class by the late 1950s with a speech he would adapt 5 years later to cement his political career. In 1959, Ron delivered a speech to GE executives that would be honed and sharpened over years, that used later for his endorsement of Barry Goldwater in 1964, a speech that history knows as A Time for Choosing. That choice in the speech was between communism, socialism, and America. Communism, socialism, and democracy. Except that communism and socialism are economic philosophies that compare to America's capitalism more than our government. In the early 20th century, both parties annihilated the American Socialist Party. Then, Teddy Roosevelt absorbed those pro-labor, pro-union, anti-fascists into his Progressive Party, which also shared and continued those agendas. Roosevelt would come in second behind Woodrow Wilson as a third party, showing Republicans just what Americans thought of their corporate greed, corruption, and anti-American ideals. Teddy knew then that America wouldn't jump on a socialist bandwagon because of the branding, and he was a much better head of the table than American socialist candidate Eugene Debs. Teddy had star power. Now, that playbook was repeated in the 1944 election, when progressive humanist and pacifist Henry A. Wallace was forcibly removed from the dying Franklin Roosevelt's ticket in favor of genocidal maniac, racist, and corporate yes-man Harry S. Truman. At very least, Republicans and Democrats conspired together to make this happen, knowing FDR wouldn't last long after the election, and whomever was number 2 would run things for the next 4 years, maybe 8. With Wallace off the ticket but allowed to stay in the administration, both he and Truman prepped their 1948 campaigns, with the latter as the Democrat and the former as the final legitimate Progressive Party candidate. Then, in the 1948 election, both parties squashed Wallace's political career and the party for which he ran. One nation under the almighty dollar, with liberty and justice for those who could afford it. During and following World War II, as America's wealthy elite sought to abolish not only communism, a pro-labor, pro-union, anti-fascist, anti-Nazi ideology, but also any remnants of socialist ideals, socialists fought for the rights of the working class. Communists fought for the rights of the working class. Capitalists convinced Americans that these two groups would overrun America and destroy it from within, reducing us to a totalitarian, authoritarian regime. Now, how they made that leap is anyone's guess. It's that this elite class feared losing power, prestige, influence, and wealth if the working class got our share of the profit pie. So, history is written by the victors, right? And ours was told that communism and socialism would turn America into a dystopian dictatorship where no one had rights, freedom, property, or opportunities. America would be the country who told its people what to do and controlled everything about their lives. Except that, in countries where these economic systems are practiced, their governments, which are different than their economies, connected to their economies, but very different from America's. Show me a socialist or communist country that practices the same kind of government America practices. Show me one that offers the same protections and freedoms for its peoples. The fence rests, Your Honor. But this didn't matter to wealthy, elite corporate bigwigs who wanted their workers to be happy with what they were given and to stop asking for more. This didn't matter to corporations who wanted to raise their profit margins with no regard for the people. This just didn't matter. And it didn't matter to the GE executives hearing this speech. It didn't matter to Americans when they heard it 5 years later as a televised endorsement for Barry Goldwater, who was a pretty far-right conservative for his time. This Goldwater endorsement, according to conservative journalist William F. Buckley, was the beginning of Reagan's coronation. 2 years later, Ronald Reagan, a less than honest man, undeserving of the high honor, would ascend to the position of governor of California. Why do I tell the story of Ronald Reagan? I can't talk about how we got here, the fall of America, the decline of our ethical integrity without this story. It's that simple. But Reagan's story isn't much different than many people we know. How I've framed this as a mediocre man with superficial skills, hitting it big, making some money, and then changing. A man who never excelled academically, who later was influenced by manipulative men with fascist agendas, and was led by propaganda, and then tried to understand complex theories it takes years and multiple degrees to understand. We all know people who know 5% of a topic but speak authoritatively, with few people able to spot the bullshit. We see it online, every social media platform. It's difficult to avoid if you're trying to have a serious conversation. People with zero academic credentials, commenting spoon-fed headlines they couldn't hope to understand, but they heard this guy say it on this channel this way, and they've regurgitated it that way a dozen times since, and they don't get called out. So now they've committed that to memory, and that's their rhetoric. Except that rhetoric isn't educated, learned, or experienced, much less pragmatic. It's drenched in feelings, not facts. seeking confirmation bias by bullet point and using that as a bully club to distract and deflect productive conversations. This was Ronald Reagan, who never aspired to higher order reasoning, critical thinking, or even learning. He wasn't in school to learn. He was in school to get attention as a football player and an actor. He didn't pursue higher education beyond a bachelor's degree in economics, mind you, from a church school, mind you, but never anything near a learned expert on the subject, nor any desire to be. He was a radio sportscaster until someone said, "Hey, you look good on camera," and then he was an actor. And he wasn't even a great actor, but he could shake hands, smile, and schmooze better than most. He couldn't be the leading man Hollywood wanted, but he could lead their union. A man who was never really special in any way that truly mattered, excelled in the most superficial ways, then succumbed to superficiality in his ideals. A man who couldn't accept the limitations of his own talent, then blamed his disappointments on the phantom fear of communism. Turning traitor against his fellow American for the sake of career advancement, influence peddling, and meeting women. I guess it's how he snagged Nancy after all. Here's where it gets really interesting in understanding how Reagan sold out and turned a 180 away from being a New Deal Democrat. The Tennessee Valley Authority was one of FDR's benchmark New Deal actions. It was originally, like Obamacare, a Republican agenda that floundered under greedy conservative rule in D.C. I've already covered this, so go back to the first part of the season for a refresher. Pro or con, for better or for worse, the South needed the TVA, and Republicans not giving it to them cost them the South for FDR's initial campaign. You'd think Ron would be all about it, right? By the late 1950s, Reagan's views had shifted so much that he saw the TVA as a prime example of socialism in America. In fairness, the government coming in and stealing a lot of land through eminent domain pissed off a lot of Southerners. But many of those changed their tunes with outhouses now in-houses and flushing with running water. The electricity many in the South weren't privileged to have before. Industry could come. Growth would be possible in an area many avoided because of the lack of sufficient progress. Reagan didn't see it that way. He didn't see the federal government saving the South with the TVA. He saw federal overreach and the government taking away the opportunity of the little man. Now, I'm not still sure how the little man's going to provide electricity and build dams, but I'm sure that would trickle down too. Reagan went to public battle with the TVA, speaking about the entity as a warning sign of America's slide to socialist ideals. Socialist ideals, again, that are economic, not governmental, and ideals that are pro-working class, anti-corruption, anti-racist, anti-fascist, and anti-Nazi. Got that? Reagan didn't care for the security of those federal or state jobs created by the Tennessee Valley Authority or the prosperity the TVA brought the lands that weren't worth much without free, non-consensual labor to work the fields. Reagan also didn't care that the TVA bought about $50 million worth of turbines from his employer per year, General Electric, according to Weisberg's article. Ronald Reagan made a lot of money from GE. He was the face of General Electric for about a decade. Reagan spoke publicly against the TVA as a link to socialism. Well, clearly GE execs weren't too keen on the boat rocking, but Reagan was assured he wasn't under any censorship in any way, by GE at least, and that he was free to speak about whatever he wanted to without any interference. But Reagan agreed to talk less about TVA and more about other examples of socialism scare tactics to create less conflict with his contractors. Here's what's also known about that era. In 1960, the Justice Department handed down indictments on executives of huge corporations, including General Electric, over conspiring and colluding to fix prices. While Reagan was dissing TVA publicly for being socialism, TVA was suing his boss, GE, TVA's suit claimed the higher-ups were meeting secretly, rigging bids and fixing prices for big consumers like TVA. Several GE executives went to prison for this. GE's stock price plummeted, millions of dollars in fines, civil suits. It was ugly. It was public. Ronald Reagan, the son of progressive parents, should have left the company. Corruption or even being connected to it would have turned Jack and Nellie Reagan's stomachs. Those Reagan ancestors who fled from that level of corruption to a land of promise the century prior would have been aghast at Ronald Reagan, standing proud with the corrupt labor oppressors. The fact is, by this time, Reagan's compassion for the little man, Joe America, the working class, had all but withered away, like his brain in his second presidential term. In 1962, Ronald Reagan was dropped by GE. They canceled his show and his contract. Reagan's General Electric Theater was losing in the ratings, and the show was expensive to produce. It was a different story every week, which means more locations, actors, sets, more everything than a show that's set in one place with a consistent cast requires. Reagan wasn't buying it. No one told Ronald Reagan no. Reagan refused to accept that the show he hosted just wasn't the best thing on television. He couldn't accept that the people didn't want him. Reagan's rhetoric wasn't about the many crimes of his employer or the corruption of big business. Reagan didn't talk about the federal government as a victim, being exploited and taken advantage of by corporate greed. Narcissists dictate the narrative. The narcissists want their story to be the story. Reagan's story was, don't you dare question the government or you'll be under a witch hunt too. Reagan's rhetoric was about freedom of speech. While many confuse that right with assuming one has the right to come into my content and comment whatever they want, that amendment only protects us from government persecution for speaking out against the government. Here, the federal government caught GE and others red-handed, had them dead to rights, and prosecuted them. Reagan, now full throttle into far-right fascism and anti-working class ideology, branded this as a corporation who spoke out and got severely punished for it. If the federal government will do that to GE, imagine what they'll do to us if we don't fight back. Don't tread on me, after all. Reagan's extremism or lackluster star power were side factors. Reagan was also a co-conspirator in a huge Hollywood labor scandal originating from when he was SAG president. He allowed MCA, his talent agency, to expand power and growth, control, monopolizing the entertainment industry. Reagan's agent with MCA, Lou Wasserman, had manipulated the scene to ensure Reagan's SAG presidency so that Reagan could do his bidding. Among that, giving MCA what they call a blanket waiver, allowing the agency to grow beyond just being a talent agency, eventually evolving to monopolize much of Hollywood and beyond. Wasserman would also be influential in Reagan's governorship and later presidency. That's coming up later. I haven't even gotten to the mid-60s yet, and I'm not going to be able to cover everything because, let me tell you, this is an entire different podcast on its own. There are books and articles on Reagan, and a lot of what I'm discussing here, I'm just condensing the important parts leading up to the dumbing down and numbing down of America. Reagan's MCA story also has a very interesting mob connection that I just don't have time to get into, but it does warrant bringing up. This era in America was completely corrupted with the mafia. Las Vegas, Hollywood, New York, Chicago, Miami, wherever there was a place the mob could infiltrate, the mob infiltrated. You've heard tales of Nixon, Elvis, the FBI, and the mob. Kennedy, Oswald, and Ruby. Where is Jimmy Hoffa? And then, for decades after, in the checkout aisle, reading about how they're all living together on an island, probably Epstein's, with Bat Boy and Kenny Rogers' original face. Conspiracies are what they are, and they're called conspiracies because of what they are. But when looking at Reagan in depth, we must recognize that on some level he was undoubtedly compromised by someone, and most likely multiple people. At very least, he was influenced, but I will argue compromised. Reagan is heralded as one of the greatest leaders in conservatism. But a closer look reveals that he was used by everyone around him as a clown. A useful clown, but a clown nonetheless. His agent, Lou Wasserman, meddled in the politics of Hollywood so his puppet could be SAG president and approve the MCA blanket waiver. Reagan was raised by parents who believed that level of big business power grabbing MCA attempted and almost got away with in Hollywood would have been appalling. With MCA as the movie studio, record label, talent agency, booking managers, and everything else in town, if you weren't with MCA, you weren't working. That's what union busting is all about. Remove the protections for the workers, those creating the products that make wealthy people wealthy. Then set the rules that most benefit the corporations, leaving the workers to take it or leave it. Their unions dissolved, the negotiators of their prosperity kicked out of those meetings altogether. Then it's just you and the big boss telling you and your many additional jobs how very little you're going to make, because now they can fire a quarter of their workforce with no backlash, thanks to right-to-work legislation. Now you have twice the work, and if you're lucky, your pay stays the same. Usually goes down. If it does stay the same, it stays the same for a long time. And that's the impact of Ronald Reagan, the man who ushered bullwarism into our workplaces, into our government, and into our culture. That's the story of a man who was raised to save the world, but through greed, ego, narcissism, and ruthless ambition became the man who sold the world. Coming up, Reagan's influence on America was incalculable. However, this playbook I've talked about over the course of this series is precisely what pushed America where we are today, where we care more about our new sneakers than we do the person who accidentally stepped on them, where we want more materialism, but cancel caring, concern, and compassion. My conspiracy claim is that this was a deliberate effort to dumb us down and numb us down so that when they come for our rights, no one knows any better or cares until it happens to them. But by then, historically, these situations, well, the atrocities are normalized, so it's just another day in paradise for most. This is America today, and it didn't have to be this way. Just like Reagan almost wasn't the man he ended up becoming. The playbook of success, despite the challenges of limited intellect, talent, skill, or work ethic, would be used by other men to cement the fate of America's collective social and cultural personality, our intellectual and emotional maturity, forever altering the course of human development and ushering in the new world order of ethical ambiguity. In the final episodes of this series, I'm looking at the evolution of America from the Golden Age, the new generation, to the Attitude Era and the era of ruthless aggression, the PG era to the reality era, the new era, the new day of America's dreams devolution to the American nightmare, chasing all that sparkly gold dust with promises that if we work hard, we too can be $1 million man. Instead, we work our bones until we're crippled, hobbling around on a fascist cane, waiting for the Undertaker to put us under a tombstone. It's back to Murdoch, Trump, and McMahon as we move forward, and we'll see how all this ties together, and we'll talk about the men who will take their place in America's quest to be better than perfect, to be the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Woo! Thanks for joining me. You can check out all my videos. I've got all my other videos on YouTube, all my original music packed up in playlists for you. My TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, my original music, clips of my acting and voiceover work, it's all in playlists for you as well. Check out my merch store. Get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. More products always coming soon. Follow me on TikTok. I'm Josh Brandon VO 3.0. Follow me everywhere online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. Well, if you like this series, consider a donation to Cash App, and don't forget to sign up for my email list. You're going to want that. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.